I thought it was brand new and open.
Oh, yeah, it's open.
Yeah, he's been taking a couple sips.
Yeah. You know
Yeah.
she was my sister, didn't you?
I did not know she was your sister.
I didn't know I was your sister.
Sister from another mister?
No, spiritually.
Oh, sister in Christ.
Yeah,
Yes, this is correct. I hear running. I thought the kids had already passed. Okay, so we're going to get started. Sips.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, let me cut myself off because that's not conducive to Bible study. And we will share this. I got to share this to the group. We may get a few people. Sometimes we get some people from Let's Talk Pearl join us. If you're joining us from Let's Talk Pearl, hi. Y'all hear enough complaining on Let's Talk Pearl, so now let's look at something positive.
I'm not even on that. I can't have that negativity in my life.
Yes.
All right. It says Laura Sermon is watching.
I turn it on
Oh.
just so I can keep people in check if they get ugly.
Okay, I was like, hey.
Oh, it is silent.
Nah, I understand.
I like to make sure people
Well, tonight we're going to look at Chronicles, and like I told you last week, because we had done First, Second Kings, I just decided there's just trying to, I don't know. Sometimes I felt like I was trying to squeeze water out of a rock. And so,
we give a little more information on the Kings. It's already covered.
Yeah.
First and Second Kings.
and so I thought I would just hit Chronicles, and we're just going to go from there. So I want you to imagine for a minute that the United States was conquered by a foreign country. And for 70 years, the best and brightest were taken to another country. All the leaders, the scholars, the educated people, all of them were sent to another country and put into exile, leaving only the really old, the infirmed, and the destitute under foreign rule. What would you want those who return to know about the kingdom or the nation that was before? Their history and all of that. What would you want them to know? Well, that's sort of the question that's faced at the beginning of Chronicles. Because like I told you, Kings is written by someone who probably was living in the exile. Chronicles was written by someone who lived after the exile, and actually it was probably written somewhere between 450 and 400 BC, which would have coincided with Ezra's return in 458 BC. 458 BC, Ezra is given permission by Artaxerxes to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple.
Whoa.
Well,
They returned because of Artaxerxes.
Well, Cyrus had already let some people go.
Well, Cyrus was
In
the one
532.
that proclamation
Right, in
because
532.
he
Right,
go,
correct.
go.
Right, that was in
Artaxerxes.
532.
All Artaxerxes did was whenever they began building the temple and everything and all, and the gates and the walls
Right.
and all, the Samaritans come down and give them soul.
Right.
Wrote back, and he went through the archives
Right,
and seen where
right.
Cyrus.
But the original permission for Ezra, Artaxerxes was the king when Ezra went to Israel. See, the timeline is spread out. Sometimes we think that there was this huge 70 years, and there was 70 years of exile, but the return to the land didn't happen at once. Cyrus was about 532 BC is when Cyrus let the first group of people go back to Israel.
Ezra says that Cyrus was the one.
Well, he let some of them go, but...
Yeah, they didn't cut. It wasn't like they exited
Right.
Egypt.
Right. But when Ezra returns to Israel to build the temple, now the first group that left under Cyrus allowed them to lay the foundations of the temple. That's really all they got done, was the foundation being laid. So you're looking at stages here. So you have one group that goes, they lay the foundation, then Ezra comes and they rebuild the temple, and then later Nehemiah will come and Nehemiah will build the walls of Jerusalem. So it's in stages. A lot of people believe Ezra wrote the book of Chronicles and Ezra/Nehemiah. And there are 4 books there in our Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible, it's actually 2 books. Ezra and Nehemiah is 1 book, and 1st, 2nd Chronicles is 1 book. Okay? And so Israelites have been put into exile. They've been put under first the Babylonians and later the Persians. The house of David has been dethroned. The city of Jerusalem has been destroyed. And as the people are coming back into the promised land, they needed to understand their place in the world in light of God's promises. So if you were to look at it, God had promised to have one of David's descendants on the throne forever. From one point of view, it looks like that failed, okay? But if you look at the story, what God is showing us is that did not fail, that God is actually going to accomplish that purpose. Now, there's some debate over who wrote Chronicles. Some say it's Ezra, like I said. In fact, there's a guy from the Hebrew University. He said this: it is generally recognized among scholars that the two books of Chronicles, originally one uninterrupted book, and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are the work of a single author who is often referred to as the chronicler. The four actual two books together are sometimes called the chronistus work. And so he says that, but then there are others that say it wasn't Ezra, that Ezra may have written Ezra and Nehemiah, but somebody else wrote Chronicles. We're not sure who wrote them. That's not what's important. What's important is why they were written. And why they were written is you've got these people who've come back into the promised land, and the chronicler wants them to understand, how do you live for God, and how do we honor God in light of what happened to us before. So think about this. You're where you're at. You go into exile because of all this sin. So the real reason why the chronicler is writing this book, whoever he is to tell the Israelites, we don't want to make the same mistake again. So here's the mistakes that were made, and here's God's promises, and this is who God's called us to be. So let's move forward and not make those same promises. So if you were exiled from your country and had to return, what things would you want your kids to know about our history?
As long as you're obedient to God,
Mm-hmm.
you have got a strong arm there.
Okay.
Fortress.
Yeah. Need God's protection. What else?
You will prosper.
You'll prosper. What about if, like, our nation was conquered and you're sending your kids back? What would you like for them to know about our nation if you were in that situation?
You got what you asked for.
Yep. And I do think I'd want them to know the Constitution, our founding documents. I'd want them to know who some of our presidents were. You know, those are information that I think is important. And then, like you said, I'd like for them to know how we got where we're at, right? Because there's that old saying, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And so that's sort of where Chronicles is coming from, this idea. So Chronicles really, one of the things Chronicles does is it emphasizes the covenants, okay? We talked a little bit about the covenants, but let's go through it again. The Hebrew word for covenant is berit, and it is a chosen relationship or partnership in which two parties make binding promises to each other and work together to reach a common goal. So why are they important in the Bible? Does anybody know why the covenants are important in Scripture? Why there's so much emphasis, especially in the Old Testament, but really in the New Testament too, about the covenants?
Well, there's only one covenant, and that was the one at Mount Sinai.
Well, there's more, because he makes a covenant with David, makes the Mosaic covenant.
He made a promise to David that he would build his house.
Right, but that was still a covenant.
Right, but that was different than
Yeah.
the covenant they were living under.
Yeah. And then there's the Abrahamic covenant that he makes
that
it all.
was before.
Make you a blessing to the nation. But it's still binding.
But the Ten Commandments wasn't even in existence.
No, they weren't. They weren't. And I do agree with you. That is probably the covenant that's binding. But really, in the Bible, there's several covenants. We can go through them all. But, I mean, there's the Noahic covenant that God makes with Noah. There's the Abrahamic covenant. There's the Mosaic covenant with Moses. And there's the Davidic covenant. And then finally, there's the New Covenant, which is the covenant with Jesus. But the covenants are important because they are the backbone upon which all of Scripture rests. If you don't understand the covenants, you really cannot understand Scripture. And I think one of the problems that we have today, I don't think we do a good job in the church teaching our history to people, whether it be biblical history or church history. And because of that, they don't understand Scripture. People don't understand why things are the way they are in the Bible. And so the Chronicle goes through great pains to walk through the covenants in his book, particularly the Mosaic covenant, the covenant between God and Israel that he made on Mount Sinai, and then also the Davidic covenant, that covenant which God made to David that he would build his house that David would build a house for God, but that God would instead build David's house. He would build David's kingdom, and one day there would be a king on the throne. And the Davidic covenant is really realized. It's fulfilled in Jesus Christ, so that's important. So let's look at the book, and let's go through the book, because I think this is interesting. Now, I'm going to talk in this study, because we went through the Kings, I'm going to really talk about the difference between Kings and Chronicles, because it's interesting. Did any of y'all get a chance to go through Chronicles this week? I know you read both of them, but I mean, did you get a chance to go back through it and familiarize yourself with it at all?
Somewhat, I did.
Somewhat. Well, we're going to talk about...
Chronicles was mostly David and Solomon.
Right, absolutely.
And the Second Chronicles carries forth with the split with the country, with the kingdom.
Right. So let's start with the first thing. The first thing about Chronicles, the first 9 chapters of Chronicles is nothing but genealogies. Okay? Now, Kings does not really deal with genealogies. That's not to say that there aren't genealogies, but you don't have 9 chapters of genealogies in the Kings. And so the begats. Yep. The begats. Such begats, such and such. Right. And so these genealogies, and it's a lot, because, I mean, let's be honest. We may remember who the 12 tribe people are, and we may even have some familiarity with Judah and his descendants, because that's the genealogy of Jesus. But how many of us really care about the other genealogies, right? So the question is, why do you think those genealogies are at the beginning of Chronicles, given what I said the purposes?
Well, just like with David, whenever he brought the Ark of the Covenant in, he didn't put it in the temple, he put it under a tent, whatever. Right. And he assists certain people to do certain things in before the where the Ark was, and also and that's really about what it all boils down to, that he was giving instructions to those that were to do certain jobs regarding the temple
and that is a big part of it. He does go through that. He does go through that genealogy. But why else do you think he hits these genealogies?
Well, they're not really that important that we know and remember them, as far as that's concerned.
We don't, which is true. But to the people he's writing to, they do matter.
Right, at that day and time, yeah, it did.
Because remember, these are people who have been displaced from their history. And so these genealogies... Now, we talk about the 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, that made up the southern kingdom. But one of the things that we do know is that when Israel sinned, we tend to think, okay, all the tribes go north, the northern tribes, those 10 tribes are the north, the 2 tribes are at the south. But we also find throughout the scriptures that there are times when the kings get so bad in Israel that some of the people, some of the descendants of Gad or Issachar or some of these other descendants will go south to live with Judah, because they realize that their nation is disobeying God. So while we've lost these other tribes, there are still people that belong to those tribes who are in the south. So when they come back to Israel, that their land is tied to their family heritage. Their inheritances are tied to their family heritage. Being able to trace your family heritage is as much about you being able to provide for your family as it is anything else.
The only thing about it is the 10 tribes is, as a whole, it never come back.
Yeah. No, I agree.
And they lived in the land of Syria at that time.
Yeah.
And they become intermarried with
them. Correct.
And they lost their identity.
Right.
Even in Ezra, it tells or Nehemiah, one of them, or maybe both of them, that they couldn't prove what tribe they were of.
Right. Correct. And so there were some that came back. You're right. True. They couldn't prove which tribe. They could have been from the tribe of Gad.
Sure. Any of the
but they couldn't prove it because the genealogies from the north had been destroyed. But those genealogies mattered to them, because to them, that was their proof that they belonged to God's people. And so why those genealogies at the beginning? I think on one hand, it's to show the Israelites this is what we've lost. But on the other hand, it's to say this is who we are. And so they're incredibly important. I don't think we need to miss this, because throughout these first chapters, God is reminding them of God's covenant promise. Chapters 1 through 9 really deal with God's covenant promise that he is going to protect his people. He's going to build for, he is going to do what he's going to do, that he is going to provide through the line of David. And so this genealogy is important. Even though when you get into these genealogies, let's be honest, most of us don't know how to pronounce half the names. And then number two, none of us care who these people are.
Athaliah went to the throne in Judah, but
Right.
she was of no seed of David.
Right, absolutely. She was actually Ahab's relative. And so you've got all this sin that's going through. So this is important. So that's the first 9 chapters. And there's not a lot to say about that. But then in chapter 10, we begin the reign of David. Notice, what's one thing when you get to chapter 10, what's one thing you notice about chapter 10? Just look at it for a second. And that deals with one person in particular. What do you notice about that?
About Saul being killed?
Right. Look at chapters 9 and 10. What do you notice about the way Chronicles deals with Saul?
Well, Saul had God's spirit whenever he first went on the throne. But then he began to look at his own self instead of looking at God.
Right.
And therefore he went astray, and that's why the kingdom was taken away from him.
But you learn that mostly from 1 Kings. Chronicles really does not deal with Saul much.
No.
It's not really concerned with Saul and his kingdom. Chronicles, unlike Kings, is concerned with David because it's through his line that Israel's future is found. And so, once again, I want you to understand why these two books are so different. Because when I was in seminary, there was this big class we did, and one of the discussions in seminary is why is there so much difference between Chronicles and Kings, and of course all these theories are batted around. But at the end of the day, the question is, who were they written to and when was it written? 1 Kings is trying to preserve a history. Chronicles is trying to prepare a people to live out this in this new kingdom, and they're not concerned about Saul. It's not that Saul's not important, it's just it has no bearing on their future. What happened to Saul doesn't have a lot of bearing on their future, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to discuss Saul. Because they're trying to tell you this is who God, the Davidic covenant that God would establish David's family on the throne forever is the key guiding principle for Chronicles. Chronicles deals with 2 major themes. It deals with David as the king and the building of the temple. And that is really all Chronicles is really concerned with, especially 1 Chronicles. Chronicles relates how David becomes the king of Israel, how God makes his covenant promises to David in Chronicles 17. It relates David's promises to build a house for God. In chapter 17, he says this. David says, "There's no one like you, O Lord, and there is no God but you. As we have heeded with our own ears." Heeded and headed are spelled the same way, I guess. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth whose God went out to redeem a people for himself and to make a name for yourself and to perform great and awesome wonders by driving out nations from before your people. And you made your people Israel your very own forever, and you, O Lord, have become their people. And so, God has made Israel his own people. That is really what Chronicles is dealing with, is the fact that David is a part of Israel, and Israel is God's particular chosen people. God has chosen them among all the nations. He has chosen to pour his love out on them. He has chosen to use them to bring salvation to the nation. He has chosen to use them as an example of what happens. All these things that are happening to Israel, God is using them almost like a billboard to the universe, to the world. This is who I am. This is how I respond. And so this is incredibly important. And so everything about Chronicles is about the building of the temple and about David as king. That's really what they worry about in Chronicles. And so that's why in 1 Chronicles 28, 8 through 9, he's talking to Solomon. He talks to them about building the temple. It's so important. So now in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek after all the commandments of the Lord your God, so that you may possess the good land and bequeath it to your sons after you forever, And then verse 9, 28:9, as for you, my son Solomon, know the Lord, that God, the God of your father, and serve him with your own heart and a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you. And so that's really, there's these things that David says, and what he's doing. Okay, think about it. These people are coming back into the land. So the things that they're concerned with, they're coming back to rebuild the temple. So what are the things that Chronicles deal with? The rebuilding of the temple, the building of the temple, and let's be faithful to God. Because once again, if you're going back, if you're bringing your people back, what will we be concerned with? You need to know our Constitution. This is what made us special. And this is what makes us, and this is how, like you said, we need to honor God. Some of those quotes that said, the only way a democracy works is if people are good, if they're Christian, because only in Christianity can democracy truly work, is what one of the founding fathers said. And so those are things you want your kids to know.
Well, we were facing the same thing in our country.
Right. Yeah.
You look at our leaders up there, and not just the ones there, the news media is a lot behind it too. They're not going according to the Constitution.
No, they're not.
So it's the same situation as we see here and all.
Yeah.
They are like, or want to be like, well, in 1 Samuel 8, he said, we want to be like the nations.
Right, they do.
So that was their downfall. They wasn't concerned with being right with God.
Right.
Because they thought that God was automatically their God, and therefore he had to do what I want you to do.
Right.
But he's not a genie in a bottle, so he don't do according to what we do.
Absolutely. Now, one thing I want y'all to notice, okay? Let's go through Chronicles together, starting in chapter 10. As you hit chapter 10, First Chronicles, chapter 10. Let's start there. That's when we taught David. I want you to sort of notice as you go through, just read your chapter heads. What are some of the things that you expect to see in David's life that you don't find in First Chronicles? In David's life.
That you don't see in First Chronicles.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the things you would think? Okay, these are important things that you don't see in First Chronicles that you do see in
Well, he prepared most all of the materials and everything, and he acquired most of the materials and everything for the building of the temple.
Right. Well,
although he never built it.
Right. Let's go back and let's just go through this. Okay, so chapter 11, you got David appointed king. Got David's mighty men. He talks about that. You got chapter 12, the mighty men joining David in Ziklag. You got that happening. You go on through that. Then you go to 13. You've got the ark brought to Jerusalem. Uzzah and the ark is found there. In 14, you find about David and his wives. You find about the Philistines defeated. Just looking through this, the ark's brought to Jerusalem, chapter 15. The ark is placed in the tent, chapter 16.
Why do you reckon the ark was put in the tent instead of put in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle?
I don't know that the tabernacle was still there. The tabernacle was...
Well, the tabernacle was still there.
I mean...
at this time.
Okay. I don't know why they did that. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it.
Has to do with what Peter said. I think it's 1st and 2nd Peter that these are the things that the prophets and even the angels desire to look into. Mm-hmm. The New Testament itself came out of the Old Testament.
Right. Well, they were trying, and he was talking about Jesus, of course. Are the things that they wanted to look into. Chapter 17 deals with the Lord's covenant with David. Chapter 18, David defeating his enemies. Chapter 19, David's men are disgraced. The Syrians are defeated. You got the capture of Rabbah. Chapter 20, the census, and so on and on and on. So we're looking at this. Just 20, David builds an altar. You got all of this. What are we missing in the story? And then 22, we got David beginning to build the temple. What's missing? What stories do you remember from 1 Kings that aren't in Chronicles?
Well, there's Bathsheba for one thing. You're right.
David and Bathsheba's not there.
Was that not in the one with...
That's in 1 Kings.
That's not the one with his wives or anything?
No, it doesn't say anything about that sin. If you go back with the one in David and his wives, that's not in there. If you go back to, it just says David took wives in Jerusalem, and it talks about the men he fathered in Jerusalem. There's no mention of Solomon there. Solomon's not mentioned until later. There's no mention of Absalom, his son, in the war with Absalom. So let me ask you this question. None of that is in 1 Chronicles. Why do you think the chronicler didn't mention David's sin or Absalom or any of these other great events? The slaying of Goliath. Why are these events not in 1 Chronicles?
They were already documented in 1 Kings.
Yeah, but some of these same things,
but the very same thing in 1
but
Kings,
some of these things are in both 1 Kings and 2 Kings,
some
though.
things are.
Yeah,
it doesn't go through the whole situation as what took place.
Right.
In other words, Chronicles more or less.
Yeah, and that may be part of it. I don't think he's brushing over David's sin. That's what some people have accused. I've read some commentators who say, well, the chronicler is trying to put David in the best light.
But also in Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and all in some of the Kings, and all it says, in other words, what they did is written in the Chronicles.
Right.
Where it's not written in Kings.
Right.
So they give more information about the Kings.
Right, in the Chronicles.
Came about. You know.
Right. So here's my 2-cent reasoning why I think there's not as much. I don't think it serves the chronicler's purpose. The chronicler's purpose for writing chronicles is to prepare the people to live in the land and to look towards that promise that God made David, that he would put a descendant on his throne forever. That is the purpose of the chronicles, is not to list all the bad things that David did. It's not propaganda, but it's also not about pointing to David. It's about pointing to what God is doing through David. And so David's important, but only because he's God's chosen vessel to pour out blessings on Israel. For the Israelites who were taken into exile, seeing the destruction of the kingdom and the fall of the Davidic line, this covenant may have seemed like a cruel joke, but for the Israelites returning to Jerusalem, this is a reminder to give them courage that God is working even when they don't see it. And so there's really no reason.
Well, no, that didn't take place in 1st or 2nd Chronicles, either one.
No.
About them being in Babylon.
It is in 2nd Chronicles. It's at the end of 2nd Chronicles that ends with that. It doesn't give detail,
well, it does.
but it ends.
Chapter,
yeah,
it tells about Cyrus.
It does talk about those things, correct.
That he would do what,
but it does say they were taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar. It does say that. Right. So the Chronicles are really, you got to remember why it's written. And why it's written informs what they do. And so when you get to the reign of Solomon in 2nd Chronicles, which is where we're going now, you have sort of the same treatment with Solomon. So the book of Chronicles shifts focus from Solomon to David. Okay, so we're focusing on Solomon. And much like concerning David, the Chronicles' primary concern is not to point out the failures of Solomon. So you don't have these discussions of Solomon's wives leading him to paganism. Once again, what it's focused on, if you look at the vast majority of what they're focused on David, it has to do with temple worship. It has to do with bringing that ark home. It has to do with all of those things he gives to Solomon to build the temple. So you really have the central part, the meat of Chronicles, this is God's command to build a temple to Solomon. David saying this is the temple, getting everything ready for Solomon so he can build the temple. And then Solomon's ministry in chapters 1 through 9 of 2nd Chronicles is really about building the temple. The temple and temple worship is the central theme of Chronicles. It is what they're the most concerned about, which makes sense. You've got a group of people who've gone back to Israel to rebuild the temple. What do you want them to know? God thinks it's very important for this temple to be here, and David's line is going to rule in the place where God's temple is. And so I think that's incredibly important. This book is concerned with covenant keeping God's faithfulness to the people, his covenant and their responsibility to keep that covenant, and also the brutal ramifications if they fail to do so. and then how that temple worship is supposed to happen. So Solomon's rule is really focused around building that temple. And the Temple of Solomon was one of the greatest in antiquities. It's beautiful. I would love to go to Israel. You know, they have a scale model of the temple there. I'd love to go to Israel and see that. Well, I'd go today. I put on a hard hat and a flak jacket and just... Yeah, I know. I would go if I could. I'd chance it.
Even if it was peaceful, I don't care to go.
Oh, I'd go if it's peaceful in a heartbeat. You got to...
Jerusalem itself is of no importance as far as we get into the New Testament.
Oh, I agree with that, but I go. There's just something about realizing when I'm walking down these streets, especially the old ones, I'm walking the same streets. Jesus, I don't think I'm going to get any spiritual energy or anything like that from it, but I do think just seeing it, I have a friend of mine who's a pastor, and he says when you actually see it, it opens up some things in the Bible that you didn't see. When you see Jesus at the Mount of Olives, you know, well, that whole passage, I'll give you an example. This has nothing to do with Chronicles, but I think it's neat. He was talking about Herod's temple. He says when you think about it, Jesus, if you sort of take the end of John, right? Jesus has done the Lord's Supper and they're heading out to the Mount of Olives. And you sort of take that as Jesus walking with his disciples to the Mount of Olives and doing what he normally did, pointing things out around them and using them as examples. He said that there's this, you know, Jesus gets to that point where he says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. He said at the old temple, and they've got a model of this, at the old temple, there was a sort of like a awning or an archway, and on that archway, it said David, the vine of Israel. And Jesus is walking and he's pointing to that, and the temple, you know, that's the vine of Israel. That's where, and he goes, no, I am the vine and you are the branches. And if you abide in me, not in this temple, if you abide in me and not in this temple, you life. And so I would just love to go and see those kind of things, you know, be able to experience them. I think that would be interesting to do.
We also find in the New Testament, since you brought it up and everything, that makes no difference whatsoever.
Yeah. No, in the New Testament it doesn't, except in Jesus. But yeah, you're right, it doesn't. It doesn't.
He told the Pharisees and Sadducees and all, said, you are of your father, the devil.
Yep.
So in John the Baptist, whenever they come to see his baptism, he said the same thing.
Yeah. And that for important. And then finally, the last part of 2 Chronicles, which is chapter 10 through 36. We're not going to do like we did last week and go through all the kings. We've already done that. As Laura said, that's a lot of names to remember that I'll forget every one of them. Here are the kings if you want to. There's my copy of the kings I gave to them. But we're not going to go back through that. But it does relate. Now, one thing you do see in Kings, Chronicles that you don't see in Kings, Chronicles deals with only Judah's kings. It does not relate Israel's kings. Once again, you're getting back to the purpose. The purpose of Chronicles is to say God is going to bless us through the line of David. He's David on the throne. Israel's kings don't matter. They're gone. They're wiped out. So they don't talk about that at all. It's through David's seed, not Israel, that God will produce his forever king. So the Chronicle focuses on Judah. The problem is the kings don't follow the Lord. They neglect the temple. They ignore God's law. They persecute God's prophets. They follow after false idols. And though there were a few good kings that we see in here, at the end of it, God disciplines his people for forsaking him. Like we said last week, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, I did tell you if there's one date you're going to remember, 586 BC is the date, because that's the date that the temple's destroyed. There's two of them. 586 BC and the other one's 70 AD. 70 AD is the year that the Romans come into Jerusalem and destroy the temple, Herod's temple, and wipe out Jerusalem that Jesus prophesied. He said not one stone will be standing on the other one. That's exactly what the Romans do in 70 AD.
there was more corruption going on inside Jerusalem before the Romans ever got there.
Oh yeah.
They ever got what inside the temple, the city.
Oh, it was terrible.
It was.
Yeah. But
people eating their own babies.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Where they fell on the ground.
Yeah.
That's
When
where they laid a piece of fry. And,
yeah. As he surrounded Jerusalem.
And all that, yeah.
Yep. And if you want to read something interesting, go back and read Masada, Massada, which is the name of it was Herod's fortress that he had built in the mountains. The last of the Jewish rebels sort of held out there and the things that happened there. That's another reason I like to go to Israel, because you can actually see the Romans to conquer Masada. So it's built on a hillside, and they had this road that wound around the mountain to get to the top, and so the Jews would stand up there and drop rocks on their heads. So the Romans actually built a over a mile long, just piled up dirt and built a ramp to the walls of Masada, because they were like, you're going to throw rocks on our head? Okay. And they just took months to build a wall, just a ramp, and they slaughtered everybody in the city, every man, woman, and child, but they were already eating their babies and dogs, and they were boiling leather, their shoes. They would boil the buckles off their shoes and eat the leather because they were starving to death.
That's the reason why it says that Jacob's trouble, that is whenever Jerusalem was destroyed, was the worst till that time that it ever was, and will be the worst even afterwards.
Yep.
Because it was the people inside that was more destructive.
Yep.
Because the Romans, when they got in, according to Josephus, the Romans got into the city.
Yeah.
They were so
appalled
with what they saw. They tried to put an end to it.
Yeah.
But in the process, they destroyed everything.
Yeah. And so, if we're going to leave Chronicles, which we're about to leave Chronicles, there's two things I want us to note. Number one, the Chronicles deals with God's faithfulness to Israel, even though Israel's not faithful to him. And it also deals with the promise that God is going to. So we're going to go back to the genealogy. And just like you said, the genealogies don't matter. But the reason I believe God preserved those genealogies is because later you would have the genealogy of Jesus that sort of butts up to this genealogy. And what you see through this is how God is guiding. There's this thin red line throughout the history of Israel, which is the red cord that leads to Jesus, and how every time there seems to be a break in the line, it's not. God is drawing this line straight to Jesus. And so ultimately, God will end the need for the genealogies. Ultimately, God will save the nations through Israel. Ultimately, God will bring his forever king, and that forever king will be Jesus. And so that's the end of the... And so the gospel in Chronicles is this, that every king failed, but God will one day bring his true temple, which is Jesus. God will bring his true king, which is Jesus, and he will fulfill all of this. All right?
Any temple of God.
Yep. Any questions?
I got to go.
I know you do. Tell your sister I said hey.
Hey.
Yes, sir. Tell her we love her.
Okay.
Any questions? I'm sorry, there's a lot to go through.
It's a lot. It's a lot of names. Is this mine?
Yeah, that's yours. I didn't have any names this week, though. Artaxerxes, which is my favorite name. That's what I wanted to... Christy asked me when we were having Ethan. You know, we had Noah. And Christy said, what do you want to name Ethan? Because we wanted to do Bible names. And I told her I wanted to do Artaxerxes. She was like, you're an idiot. I said, well, he's a Bible name. I said, we could call him Art.
Art Ellenberg.
If my husband could have had it his way, Bobby's name would have been Jethro.
Oh, goodness.
Jethro.
I would have told him only if we can make his middle name Tull. It's a good band.
And then he wanted the name Scotty Seamus.
Oh, that's a good Scottish name.
Yeah.
I don't think... Is Jethro a Scottish name?
Mm-mm.
I think that's a redneck name.
Yeah.
Redneck.
Hillbilly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a hillbilly name, and
Yeah.
Seamus is a good Scottish name. Yeah. I could see Seamus. That'd be a good one.
We have a lot of Irish in us. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Top of the morning to you.
Could be a leprechaun.
Yep. Seamus the leprechaun.
We have Abigail and Elizabeth.
Yep.
How we came up with Bobby is I wanted a family name.
Yep.
So